Welcome to Tree Talking Time, where we talk all things tree dogs, from the smallest fights to the largest hounds, treating squirrels to bears and everything in between. And from time to time, we might even run a little fast game.
So I'm going to tell you probably one of my very favorite stories. It was a little bit of a scary one for me. I was hunting up at the spring roundup at the Kern Fife, with the Kern Fife Association up at Elnora. And we had a guy, and he was kind of a quiet guy, and he was like, can I spectate? And I was out with Doug DeRosset, who had top of the line Stevens Curs at that time. I'm not sure. He had a dog named Peter. And she was a coon dog, squirrel dog. And there was another guy on the cast. And then there was me. We were squirrel hunting, and Doug's dog treed, the other guy's dog split treed, and they went running. Well, where we were hunting at, they had drained a lake. It was like, I guess it was like some of the, strip mines where they, and so, or, they had made a lake out of it or whatever.
Okay.
All I know is I didn't know this, and I'm hunting and they go off. I mean, they're literally, how when somebody declares a dog treat, I mean, they're pretty much run into the tree. And there's like this little creek. It looks like a little creek of water. And they're long gone. And I decide, okay, I have to, kind of just jump over. It's not a big deal. I mean, it's just like every little creek that we all come to that you can pretty much, get a little run at it and cross it without walking through it.
Yeah.
Well, it's quicksand.
Oh.
The bottom falls out. And every time I move, I get sucked down even further. And my cast, there is no keeping the cast together on this.
Jeez.
And every time I move, I'm getting sucked down further and further, and I am yelling. I thought I was going to die. Like, Billy's back to the motel with Clay. I'm in the middle of nowhere, and out of the blue comes the spectator. He had been kind of lollygagging and just kind of walking way behind us, and he hears me, and he pulls me out of this quicksand. But at this point, I am up to my chest. I mean, I am almost to my shoulders in this quicksand, freaking out, and yeah, so he saved my life.
That's
they
incredible.
never did come back for me. I ended up having to throw my clothes away because it smelled like sulfur. Like, how that you can get that sulfur smelling water in Indiana. And I could never get the smell out. It smelled like rotten eggs. It was so terrible. So yeah.
That's scary.
That was one of
That's good that you had a spectator along that guy is behind you.
And thank God he was behind me and not running with them to the trees, or I really think I'd have died in Indiana that day, and nobody probably would have found me. It was terrible. So yeah.
No kidding.
That was probably one of my most memorable events. I tell that story to this day, and I don't think people believe me, but we all get out there, and when we go to the woods, I try to explain competition hunting to, I work in education.
Yeah.
So these people don't know what I do. They don't understand it.
Yep.
And my friends, I have a lot of friends that aren't hunters, and I try to explain it, and like with bird dogs, they'll buy birds and they'll, place birds different places and stuff. But we are the rare breed. You go to a kite, fox pen. It's all fenced in.
Yep.
There's usually coyotes in there, not us. We drop ourselves off into the middle of nowhere. We hope we're not trespassing. We hope our guides got permission, and we let our dogs go out and look for wild game. I'm like, we're a rare breed.
We definitely are.
So yeah, that was one of my more memorable stories.
That's scary though.
So,
but like I said, that's awesome that guy was behind you and was able to pull you out.
It was, he was my, and what's bad is you meet so many people over the years, and I was in my 20s at that point. I'm in my 50s now, and like I can picture him, like what he looks like to this day, and I can't remember his name. I feel terrible. This man saved my life. Well, I'm a terrible person. He saved my life. I can't even remember.
I can remember faces.
I always, one of my key moves is to be like, if I have like Rose or Billy or somebody with me, I always be like, oh, this is my husband, Billy. And then the person usually will introduce themselves, and it kind of takes a little bit of pressure off, but but outside of that, yeah, I know everybody's name. I actually usually know their dog's name more so than I know theirs. So that's sad.
Yep. No, it's funny. I can remember pedigrees and dogs, and my wife's like, how can you not remember to stop and get groceries or pick something up? But you can remember, 5 generations of a pedigree of a dog that you don't even own. I'm like, I don't know.
It's priority. Priority. It's all about priorities.
Exactly.
So.
Well, why don't you introduce yourself?
All right. So I am Amy Kovac Thomas, and I have been involved with Cur Dogs since I was 9. I'm 51 now, and I still have the same line of dogs out in my kennel. And I'm not near as active as I was, but I was. I've seen a lot of people come. I've seen a lot of people go. I've seen a
Mhm.
lot of people remain. I have a lot of respect for the people that I've seen stay
Yeah.
true
Hmm.
throughout the years.
Oh yeah.
Alan Franklin I think is amazing and has an amazing line of dogs, and
Hmm.
you know people give Carl Smith a hard time, with all the DNA stuff, but the fact is he's still in it and he
Yep.
still has dogs that tree, and to me that's more of what my focus has always been. It's
Hmm.
you know having a dog, taking pride in what you have, not just getting a stud dog and that's the greatest stud dog in the world until you sell it or it dies, and then you get a totally different bloodline stud
Yep.
dog, and then that's the greatest stud dog in the world. I mean, so
Yep.
I
People
kind
that
of
commit to
like
something.
yeah, I like people who commit and stick to stuff and continue to have a product. Doyle Sherman,
Hmm.
I mean, these are people who have been around for decades, and
Yep.
that says a lot.
Hmm.
Anytime you're into any kind of animal, competition, animal breeding, you will see a lot of people come and go.
Yep.
You know, it's phases, and and they may have a really good animal, but it may not reproduce. I mean, look at racehorses. How many of those
Yep.
big racehorses actually reproduce something that runs like they did? You
Not
know,
many by comparison to like we have a lot better luck in the tree dogs, I think.
I think we do too. I think it's because we have a shorter gestation period.
Very true.
My dad bred pigeons, and John Saunders actually I tried to cross my dog. I'm not sure she's bred. She's either going to have one or two puppies, or she's having a really great false pregnancy. But his dad and my dad used to raise pigeons when we were little,
Hmm.
even before we knew that everybody was going to be into hunting dogs, and they were top of their line, and I think they could produce so many generations in such a short time.
Yeah.
It helps figure out a breeding program.
And at the same
So I
point.
think that's why with dogs
Hmm.
makes it different.
And also litter size, where with a horse it's like you get one.
Hmm.
Where with dogs, yeah, you might have one or two, but you can have the potential for 9 or 10.
Oh yeah.
So I got into cur dogs 12, 13 years ago, maybe 14 years ago, something like that. But prior to even getting into them, I was in high school, and you know, Squirrel Dog Central and Squirrel Haters and the forums were all big, and I lived on them. I was, and like people had, this is the days when people actually had a personal website, and
Yep.
I studied your family's website and your line of dogs. I wanted one, and at that time, like I said, I was in high school. I really didn't know much. Didn't know dog haulers existed. So like I'm thinking the only way I could get one is to drive all the way to Missouri from Pennsylvania. So that's why I never did, because didn't realize dog haulers were a thing. And because I really liked the look of your dogs. I always thought treeing curs, which that's what we're going to talk about a lot here today, and kind of how they got started. But your line of treeing curs, and I always really liked the looks of your dogs. I liked the history of your dogs, and you guys had a really good story, and that was what I really liked. And at that point, you'd already had your dogs for many years. Like I said, this is 10 years ago, and you said you've been in this for 40 years, so you'd had 30 years of history already there. So that was something I liked. It showed, like you said, the commitment.
Well, I appreciate that.
Let's talk a little bit about your line of dogs, if you don't mind. Or actually,
Sure.
before we get into your line of dogs, let's start with what a treeing cur is, because I think that'll make a little more sense once we start talking about your line of dogs.
So tree curs have always been somewhat controversial. Like I said, we are started with a Walker Stevens cross.
Hmm.
So we've always had hound in our dogs, always.
Hmm.
And then we bred to the mountain curs, and then eventually we went back out to the hounds and stuff. But a trained cur was the first trained cur. Let me tell you about the first trained cur that NKC registered. It was actually an Airedale hound cross.
Hmm.
So it wasn't even a cur cross.
He was a hairy brindle.
Yeah,
I don't know, probably 70 pound, fuzzy looking
I'm
weird.
not.
He looked weird.
Yeah, Melvin Hopper, and so like when we were able to register with NKC, which was the very first registry to allow for trained curs, and trained curs were basically created to allow, if you had a good Stevens cur and you crossed it, to a Tennessee trained brindle or a mountain cur, you crossed, or, like with us, we had hound. There was no stipulation of, what those two breeds had to be, as long as they were tree dogs. You had to have a tree dog in there. So, that's where our opening came in, because like, you said, we had the dogs for a very long time before we ever were able to register them and start competing with them. And, so that's where the trained curs came from. Then somewhere in the midst of all this, probably, I guess about 20 years ago, there came to be a push where the cur and feist didn't want hound in them anymore.
Okay.
And I'll be honest with you, I got banned from the National Cur and Feist Association for, Doyle Sherman. A lot of us were up there. I think Chuck Berry was the president. There were a lot of people who were against the trained curs having some hound in them. And I was like, guys, like the very first trained cur had hound in it.
Yeah.
And that was after we had bred to like Rat Attack and X Factor. And, I think because we went to these big name hounds, it kind of put a spotlight on us that we were breeding hound into these dogs. But really all we were doing was going back to, what we had originated with. And then after we did that, we went back in, and I mean, that's just a breeding program. I don't think my dogs have ever looked, so houndy that you would be like, oh, I don't know if there's any cur in there whatsoever. We've always had the big chested. I mean, we still have natural bobs in our dogs.
Yeah.
I have 3 females down there, and every single one of them has a natural bob tail. That's kind of something that I personally just keep alive, because I think it's something special in our cur dogs that I don't want to lose that gene of producing that. So that whenever I keep a female, that is kind of one of my stipulations. But so my brother was working for UKC, and, there was a lot of fear that, with UK that I would push to, because I was, involved with the Cur and Feist as the vice president, push to change the hunt formats from NKC to UKC. And there was just a lot of controversy. And I'll be honest with you, like the websites that you talk about, they were controversial. They, there was a lot of hate going on and a lot of stuff being said. And,
I know.
It was really hard to deal with. And I'm not going to deal with that. I would rather be quiet. It's never mattered to me whether we had a world champion, which we've had, several of those, or whether I was just hunting my dogs on my farm. Like, I guess I, kind of got caught up in the politics of it, but then you kind of get to the point where you're like, really? The small-mindedness of some of the people on some of those things, I just didn't go on. Yeah. Like, I couldn't even say anything without being dumped, and I was just like, it was tough. It was hard, And I'm a woman in the sport too, which doesn't help. And I was a woman going through a divorce, which doesn't help either. And, it just, to me, it was better just to, I made a kind of a fresh start with PKC because they had the squirrel dog, program at that time, and then shows, and nobody knew me, and I liked not being known. And now everybody knows me in PKC again. My husband always said, like when they changed my jobs, he said, could you just be mediocre at something? Could you just go in and just do the bare minimums? And I'm like, not in my nature, not in my dad's nature. It's not in my brother's nature. It's not in my nature. We're just not mediocre people. Like if we do something, we want to do it with total dedication and, put our all into it. So, but with the trained curs, with the trained curs, it was, like I said, we've always just been very honest. I mean, and I'm going to be very honest with you. There were times where in the very beginning, my dad was offered mountain cur papers for our dogs.
Yeah.
And we didn't take them.
Because your early dogs, they looked a lot like mountain curs.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, other than the first female, I would say everything else I remember seeing a picture of looked like a mountain cur.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, outside of that first one.
And they all were, 3/4 or more?
Yeah.
So, it would explain
per dog. Yeah. I guess that's where and maybe I'd be in a different spot. Maybe if I
Mhm.
had those elusive OMCBA papers on the train curs, I'd be further along. But I mean, Doyle Sherman could have probably done the same thing. But it's just there's going to be people that are going to go on bandwagons, and they're going to. It's just like horses. I
Mhm.
always say horses because my husband's into horses. So I know outside of dogs, I feel like my father-in-law trained horses and competed. So we have
Okay.
a lot of like animal husbandry
Yeah.
in our home.
You
But
see the
just like with
similarities?
horses, yeah, you get fake papers on horses, but
Mhm.
what does that do? It
Yeah.
doesn't benefit anybody.
No.
You know, I've got two labs here, and I have to hope that their pedigree is accurate. I didn't raise any dogs from them beforehand,
Mhm.
so I'm trusting the breeders before me,
Yep.
just like other people do when they get into our sport. And so I don't want to lie about it. They're trained curs. That's
Yep.
what they are.
Uh,
So if somebody has had the blessing of not having anything diluted by someone else, then I'm happy for them because that's really how it should be.
mhm. Now that we kind of have defined the train current, we've even talked a little bit about your line. Let's actually delve into your line, if you don't mind, where it started and kind of how it progressed.
So like I said, started with the Walker Stevens, and then it was Stevens onto that, and then it was Mountain Curs onto that female, and then we outcrossed those to that's when we started doing the high power dogs. We did Rock River Gap, we did X Junior, we did Rat Attack, we did an English cross
Okay.
that went back to like Grizzly and the Wildflower dogs. And that was actually one of our really really good crosses. My dad. If there was a good dog out there, I mean, a well known dog, and my brother was instrumental in the research behind dogs.
Okay.
He raises chickens now,
Mhm.
and when he does something, he does it 100%. He's checking the genetics. He's looking. He would look at the reproduction numbers and the percentage of pups on the ground and pups that had made champion titles, and so we never bred to a dog that wasn't a proven reproducer to whatever degree that you can look at statistic wise on
Yeah.
paper. So and then, like here recently, when I took frozen semen, I had my rat dog selected, and we still
Mhm.
have semen on him and Shamrock and X Factor.
Okay.
So when I crossed, knew I had it, and I knew I wanted to cross onto Alan Franklin's dogs because they're dual dogs. They're squirrel and coon dogs.
Mhm.
And like I said, he's been around for decades.
Yeah.
He's got generations of dogs that, reproduce. So I had made a deal with a guy. I gave him a puppy and said, hey, down the line, I want a puppy in return. And you always wonder if somebody's going to honor those deals. Like
Yep.
you're like, oh, please honor it. And he did. So he actually bred a female of ours that I had taken my rat dog and bred it to a dog that was out of a dog. Oh, he was a mountain cur. And he was actually pretty well known back then. And I'm drawing a blank on his name. I feel like getting out my current Feist yearbook because I'm pretty sure I can find him. But the guy had crossed that line onto a nocturnal nailer walker. And
Okay.
so he had two females for me that were phenomenal. And he took one and he bred it to this cur dog that was off of, his friend had off of Alan Franklin's line, and then sent me a puppy. And,
Okay.
of course, my stipulation was, she'd be bobtailed, and she was. And then I took her and I crossed her back onto my rat semen.
Okay.
So really, it was like granddaughter back to grandfather.
Mhm.
And then that's where my Maisie dog came from. And so, like I said, I just tried to cross her onto John Saunders' Boone dog, who goes back to a hard knocking Mike female and Doyle Sherman's Jam and Bow, because
Okay.
that's another line that, I know reproduces.
Yeah.
And, I look, you have to respect other people. You can't just be like, oh, my dogs are the best.
Mhm.
You're going to have to go out and you have to pay attention to
Yep.
what dogs are doing it.
Oh, yeah, you can't live in a
So,
vacuum.
no, you can't. Hopefully, maybe knocking on my desk here in a couple of weeks. Even though, if I just get one puppy, I'll be happy.
Mhm.
Like I said, I can't quite tell But we'll see. If not, I'll try it again.
Yeah. Now, going back to, you said, so your third generation, you had, if I remember correctly, 2 litters out of the same female and 2 different males, correct?
Yes. We went to Sour Sport, who was owned by Fred Sour.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went to Porter's Chief the second time, and he was off of Jesse James and Porter's Penny. So the Roaring River Mountain Curs. And that's where the natural bobs came in.
Okay.
Was from Porter's Chief.
Those 2 litters, didn't you cross them back and forth a little bit?
Yeah. I'm sorry. I missed that, didn't I? We crossed those back and forth and then took the offspring to the hound stock out.
That's what I thought.
So really, we went in several generations before we ever went back out to hound.
Yeah. So by the time you crossed out to a hound, shoot, them puppy or those dogs
we were like 7/8 at that point. Like it was pretty much back to straight fur.
Mm-hmm. Shamrock was one of those, and I remember he was one of like my favorite dogs that you had at that time.
Yes. I actually thought about breeding Maisie to his semen. We've got his semen down at Mizzou. But she is 3/4 cur, a quarter hound. And I'll be honest with you, she's not a coon dog. And I don't like that. If you ask me what her flaw is, I would, she's got some nasty teeth. Never make a show dog, let's put it that way. But she's probably one of my favorite dogs. She's enthusiastic. She travels well. She's smart. Like we shoot her and she falls over and, plays dead. Kids love her. But that was kind of the reason why I went out to John Saunders' dog, Boone, because he had Jam and Bow in there, and then he had that hard knocking Mike, because I don't want to lose a dog that's dual purpose. I always say if you want a great coon dog, your best bet for probability is still get a hound. If that's all you're doing, have a hound. If you want a squirrel dog, get a fight. If you want a combination dog that can do it, that's where I always say the cur dog fits in. It fits in for the guy who doesn't have a lot of big timber to hunt. He might live in a subdivision. Nobody's going to look at your dog. But the only problem you have is, like, I remember releasing a conservation agent, spots and having people be like, "Oh my God, it's pit bulls!" When pit bulls were,
Yep.
That's about the only thing. I'm like, no, they're not pit bulls. I promise.
Especially when you with most of your dogs being red there for a little while.
Yeah, red or big brindle and white. They're all. I mean, most of the mountain curs are pit colors. It's just that terrier that's back in them. So think about it. You got blue, brindle and white, fawn colored, red colored. Those are all pit colors too.
Yep.
So. Yeah, if they would all freak, people would freak out. And you gotta, no. I remember I had an insurance agent come to my house, and my insurance was going to drop me. How they come and they do the on-site inspection, and I had to put a fence up by a retaining wall, and he reported me for having a kennel full of pit bulls. Like I was like, I had to go round and round with my insurance company. I had to send them like copies of my papers. It was terrible. Yeah,
I'm sure it was.
So,
I mean, looking back, that's kind of funny that he thought a kennel full of cur dogs was a kennel full of pit bulls, though.
Yeah, I probably looked like I was, fighting dogs over in East St. Louis or whatever. Yeah, that's me.
Yep. Amy breeding the fighting dogs down there.
Breeding the fighting dogs. Get me some fighting chickens, some fighting dogs. I'll be all good. Did you see that? I could see me being busted for that working in our school district. That'd be awesome. Yeah, so Shamrock, like I said, I thought about breeding Maisie to him, but then I don't think she's the female for that. My brother even said, that might be pretty curry, and, I listen, the thing about my brother is when he talks, I listen because he's very knowledgeable, very logical, very knowledgeable. He used to drive me crazy as kids because, I was the emotional one. I'd get all, bent out of shape about something, and he'd be all cool and calm and logical, but that's his strength. That's what's, taking him far in life. And, and I thought about it. I was like, no, I do want something with, a little more hound in it and just a little more go. And John said the Boone dog is actually a better coon dog than he is squirrel dog.
Okay.
We went squirrel hunting with him, and he picked him off close. And then when they went far, he went far with him. I mean, he was treed for an hour on the last squirrel. So, nice. I mean, I was like, okay, that's what you kind of do is you have to look at your dogs and look at your flaws.
Yeah.
And go, what might fill in the gap? It may or may not, but I'm at least going to always shoot for a dog that's going to have those traits that maybe my dog might be lacking some in.
Definitely. No, and that's what I think makes you a good breeder, and what stood out about your line and the test of time, and that you're thinking about these things. Like you said, it's not you're not looking for the flash in the pan stud dog that's going to be winning the hunts and not reproduce, and on to the next thing.
Right. And I don't know if I'll get into competition hunting again. I'm not sure. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, both my kids, PKC, coon hunted our dogs.
Mm-hmm.
Clay hunted the Fred dog who was off of our X Factor.
Okay.
And then Rose hunted my Lil dog who just passed away here recently, and she went back to a cur and Thrasher. Thrasher was the walker. Her mother was a double bred Thrasher female.
Okay.
And they both hunted in PKC.
Mm-hmm.
The Millie dog I had, she was just a puppy, and that was the first dog Clay ever hunted in PKC. And I don't even think it was July, and she was born, I think October. I mean, she was like 8 months old. She was
Wow.
little, and they were like, but she was treeing.
Mm-hmm.
She got a little freaked out. I'm going to tell you, the little dog, when the big hounds opened up, looked like, whoa, what was that? But she was at the tree with them. She wasn't quite sure about getting there with them, but she'd stand back and bark and stuff. But that was the first dog he hunted, was a cur puppy down at the breeder showcase. Billy Bell lent him a light, and we headed off to the woods. So
That's awesome.
that's why I want a dog that's going to be able to be with me and do what I want to do in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
When I was hunting with John, we went hunting with Boone. I kept telling my husband I had a crush on his dog. I was like, I have a crush on John's dog, and I've been watching him for a while, and I, show my husband pictures, and then I was like, I wonder what his pedigree is, and then he had the right pedigree, and then I'm like, let's go hunting with him. And then we went hunting with him. My husband's like, now I know why you had a crush on him, but when we went hunting, my dogs, I told John, I said, your dog looks like a dog that's hunted hard. My dogs look like a fat lady hunts them at her farm or one of the other hay farms right down the road. They were like, huh, so, but the thing is I have the potential.
Mm-hmm.
If I let it die out, I no longer have that opportunity. I don't have that chance to get back into it when I retire in 1 to 4 years.
Yeah.
I don't have that opportunity to, I'm a grandma now, to have these moments. Maybe my grandchildren want to do these things.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have those opportunities if we let it die out.
Exactly.
So I feel like I'm kind of in like airplane holding mode right
Mm-hmm.
now in life.
No, I understand.
I'm like, it's one of those things that when you are a breeder, life may not be the most, opportune for you at that moment to do what you did do. But like I said, I want the potential to do it. And I want a dog that hunts both squirrel and coon equally, and that's why we've always enjoyed the cur dogs. But they're also pets. I don't have to, when I went down to breed me, and we were going to try to go last Sunday. Storm rolled in, and at $5 for diesel fuel, I didn't feel like driving an hour to go hunt with John. But the fact is I can actually put him in my little Toyota and drive him to the woods if I want to.
Yep.
They're well behaved.
Yep.
So I like a dog like that.
I agree. That's what has drawn me to the cur dogs, is just the demeanor, the
Mm-hmm.
willingness to please, and the biddability by comparison
Yep.
to what I've seen in coonhounds. And I will agree that I've never had a cur dog that was a coon of the same coon dog caliber as a good hound. But when my dog crosses a property line, I can hit the tone button and she turns around and she comes back to me. And I know quite a few walker dogs that won't do that. So,
well, and nowadays, I mean, and I love hounds. I love writing about the hounds. I mean, it's actually something I really enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact is, even in squirrel dogs now, we're getting dogs that they go far and they go independent.
Yep.
And there's always going to be a market for a competition dog, and there's always going to be a market for a pleasure dog. And I hope to be back in where I have my foot in each one of those worlds,
mm-hmm.
where I can go either way. Right now I feel like I have, after hunting with John, I feel like I have pleasure dogs.
Mm-hmm.
I was always thought Maisie was like my hope, and I was watching her against his dog, and I was like, yeah, maybe not. Maybe if we get a puppy, we'll be back there. And that was something for us, like, when we got into competition, my dad had the first 4-way Super Bowl.
Oh, wow.
Grace was a world squirrel champion. Ruby was a world tree champion. Sage was a world coon champion. Not sure if Copper ever got a world championship or not. But I mean, these dogs, my Windy dog, who was a Canadian cur, she was half hound, but I had her as a trained cur. But when the Canadian curs, you could cross out a generation and go back in, and then they would be Canadians again.
Okay.
So, she was a world free champion. We had we had so many bench show titles because our dogs were so built.
They definitely were.
That I can't. What's sad is when you can't remember how many world champion titles you had.
That is pretty bad.
It is, and I feel terrible that I'm sitting here and I'm like, okay, running through my head all of them. But the fact is when we were doing it locally, people were like, oh, they can only win in their backyard. Well, that made my dad upset. My dad had his own business, and if we went out, we only went on 3 vacations my whole childhood. I think that's why I like to travel so much. But we couldn't go on vacation because if he wasn't working, the money wasn't coming in.
Mm-hmm.
So then when he, went out and, he got disability for his knees, from Vietnam and stuff, he could travel more. And we did travel more. We went to Minnesota, Wisconsin. We traveled all over the country and won everywhere we went,
Mm-hmm.
And he had a point to prove, I think we've proven our point. And, what's funny is I don't really have to advertise litters because right now I have 4 dogs spoken for plus mine if she would have them 5.
Mm-hmm.
And, only one of those is somebody new.
Okay.
But they know of my line. Everybody else is a return buyer.
Yeah.
So I'll get, I won't hear about dogs. And then somebody will call me and they'll be like, hey, my dog's, 10, my dog's 12, are you breeding a litter anytime soon? And I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't even know, you had that dog out there, but okay. So much for staying in touch.
Yeah.
But it's been that's probably been one of my most rewarding things is just, it's all the return buyers. Mm-hmm. And these are people who enjoy they're pleasure hunters.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me says a lot when
definitely,
you don't hear, and then somebody says, hey, my dog's 10 and I need to get a young one from you. And you're like, all right. Okay.
That is definitely something I look forward to in the future, hopefully having the same thing. I'm just getting into this, but looking long term, I hope at some point that I have my own breeding program. That's my dogs, that I can be saying the same thing. And that definitely says a lot when people come back because that means you're doing something right.
Well, and we all start from somewhere,
mm-hmm.
but we all start from somewhere. My dad, the Stevens cur that had the accidental cross with the Walker, those were the Deep River dogs. Deep River Mike was a world champion. The Stevens dogs went back to Bill Mann. It was years later that we found out where the Homer dog came from, and it was Bill Mann. And, he was well known, for breeding, amazing, Stevens dogs.
Mm-hmm.
I actually got a chance to hunt with him one time down in Arkansas. And I had my Jane dog, she was off of the Jesse Jane's dog. And I swear a hot dog could have got the better of her. She was the best tree dog, but you never needed to knock anything down to her. She did not want to fight anything. She did not want to fight anything. She was as docile as they came, but she was a heck of a dog. And Bill's hunting with Stevens, and it was March, so I got pregnant with Clay in November, so December, January. I was 4 months pregnant, and we're hunting together, and he says, hey, looks like there's hogs that gone through here. And I'm like, wild hogs? He's like, yeah. And I've got Old Yeller coming to my head. I'm like, I'm 4 months pregnant. I'm like, where am I going? I'm going up a tree. This dog's not protecting me. This dog's gonna be out of here. This is not we've sold a lot of hog dogs, with our amazing dogs, but this was not one of them. And so 4 months pregnant, I'm looking for the nearest tree, thinking, my goodness, I'm out here pregnant with wild hogs.
That's funny.
So the kids have been hunting since they were in me. They were in utero. They never stood a shot of not, being in the woods.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of going back to that, it's just that we all got to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Where we take that is a direction. And that's why I was talking about if we are so reliant on breeders being truthful and breeders making good choices for all of us down the line, because look at you. you're in this now, and you're going to take your dogs and you're going to go in certain directions,
Mm-hmm.
And, we took Stevens and a Walker that were already from well-established lines, and took it our way. So even though I say, it's our line of dogs, it's all, a collaboration of effort.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's so important that we all do our due diligence on breeding good dogs and being honest about what we have, and
Mm-hmm.
not breeding dogs unless they've proven, that they are tree dogs, and I know, like, I had two females one time. I had Paige and I had Kate. And Paige, she was so phenomenal, and she produced mediocre puppies.
Okay.
I'll just be honest. They
Mm-hmm.
would tree, but they were not what you would call barn burners.
Mm-hmm.
And Kate was more of a mediocre dog in the woods, and she threw the millie dog. I actually sold her to a guy who said she was a bad dog, and I was like, I'll buy her back. Because I had raised a litter of puppies, and turns out, I mean, they were phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
And this is back with squirrel haters, and I was like, he was ripping me up and down. I'm like, I will buy her back. I will buy her back. I will buy her back, because at this point, her puppies are doing phenomenal.
Yeah.
And I am thinking, oh my God, I raised, a litter from these two sisters, and I sold the wrong sister. Like, she was a reproducer.
Yeah.
Was she, the greatest dog? No. But she reproduced and she treed.
Mm-hmm.
And she threw some of the best puppies I've probably ever raised, and I never could get her bought back. He ripped me up and down, but he wouldn't sell her back.
Makes no sense. You're gonna rip the dog.
No, that's just where people are looking for reasons to be mean, say ignorant things. Like, I guess I've never understood that, because I feel like we're all in the same sport. We all want to have a chance to hunt squirrels, raccoons. Like, we are all together.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if we were lobbying against someone trying to take away squirrel hunting, we would all lobby together. So I've never quite understood that concept, especially in the world that we live in.
No, I agree.
We should not tear each other down. We should build each other up, and work
Mm-hmm.
together for our sport, because there's a lot more people out there that want to take our sport away than want to join it.
Nope,
So, I'm grateful there's people like you that want to get involved and take it in the future.
a rising tide raises all ships. So,
Mm-hmm.
So we all need to be working together. So,
Yep.
now you mentioned about your female being a good that one female being a good reproducer. When you were on Steve's podcast, you mentioned something about genetic testing and kind of how you were seeing which males were more predominant. I would really like to learn more about that and know more about what you guys were doing.
Okay. So we were, well, I haven't done anything with these dogs, but like when we were the F1 generation for UKC, we DNA tested everybody, and we went out of a place in Oklahoma. So we would swab the dogs and send them in, and then they would send you back the markers, and so that you would have like this, AE, FF, anything that was a double letter was a dominant gene.
Okay.
So if you had a dog that had, AC, CE, had two different letters for every chain that they sent you of what they evaluated, it kind of told you that your dog was more, it didn't have the dominant genes. It had more recessive.
Mm-hmm.
And the number of double letters that you had would show you the percentage. So if you had two AAs or two DDs, or four, that would be 20% or 40%. And most stud dogs at that time, talking, the guy's name was Gary, talking to him, most stud dogs had about 20% fixed genes when they would test them. So if you got anything close to 50, like if you started getting up there above 20, you pretty much had a dog that was reproduced. In fact, one of the best females I had for reproducing had no fixed genes, but when we'd breed her to a stud dog that was highly fixed, she was just like she had a lot of recessive. So, he would kind of pull that. So, that's something that, like I said, and like in Steve's podcast, I mean, those genes could be the brindle color. You know what I'm saying? It's hard to tell, exactly what those codes were for, but you knew that they had dominant genes to throw.
Mm-hmm.
So you would see those reproduce.
Okay.
Stronger than you would in other dogs that were primarily, recessive.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Very interesting.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, like even looking at my own children, dyslexia runs in my husband's family pretty dominantly.
Hmm.
And there's four grandchildren. There's two boys, two girls. And three out of four of those children have dyslexia.
Hmm.
So you know how you in school they'd make you do the Punnett squares and stuff, and you would see like there would be three out of four, when
Yep.
you did these crosses. Like even in our own family, three out of four grandchildren ended up with having this. I mean, being tested at the universities and having dyslexia, and
Hmm.
one didn't. So genetics. Like I said, my dad got really into breeding when he was doing the pigeon, and there were sayings like, "Oh, a white pigeon will never win." There was a race called the combine. A white pigeon will never win it. White pigeons get picked off by predators. Blah blah blah. So what his goal became to breed a white pigeon that would win the combine, and he
Yeah,
did. Stardust was the pigeon's name that won the combine.
that's
But
awesome.
he, like him when we went down to breed Maisie, him and John Saunders, senior, they both raced the pigeons, and I mean they got their pigeons from guys who actually used the pigeons in the World War to take messages and
Oh
stuff.
wow.
So yeah, so I mean, there's a lot that has to do with genetics,
Hmm.
and and that's why we've always line bred. But you have to you can go in so much, but you have to go out eventually because if not, like I mean, I've had male dogs born without testicles. I'll just be honest with you. Like
Hmm.
when I said you can get double the good and double the bad, that's the truth.
Yeah.
And it's the truth for anything that you do that with. Look at the royals. In England.
Hmm.
Hemophilia was prominent in them.
Yep.
They kept it in, and you can't just keep going in. You have to eventually get some genes out,
Hmm.
but you always want to try to keep yourself concentrated.
I know when a lot of times when you make those outcrosses seem to the hybrid vigor seems to really strike, and those outcrosses seem to do really well. But
Yes,
sometimes the outcrosses don't always reproduce. So how has that
right.
worked out for you guys?
I'll be honest with you, it hasn't been too bad because I think we're breeding such a concentrated dog. With any
Hmm.
of the dogs, I'm gonna be the first to tell you, you're gonna have, great dogs in a litter, mediocre dogs in a litter, and you might have one that does not turn out at all. I mean,
Hmm.
it's just what it is. But for the most part, I mean, here we are, how many years later? And, what, 42 years later? And, we've had a lot of what you would consider the hybrids,
Hmm.
and you do get that vigor, when you go out, that first cross with that hound is usually a healthier dog. It's a more robust dog. It lives longer,
Hmm.
but the fact is that still when you go back in, you're kind of, keeping that cycle because at this point, think about it, I should be out. Like,
Hmm.
I should not have, with the hybrids, like
Yeah.
we should be done. But I think it's like anything else. You really have to look at what you're breeding to.
Hmm.
Not all lines of dogs reproduce. Not every walker dog out there is, in the, reproducers list. There's
Yeah.
a reason.
Hmm.
So that's why you have to do your homework before you make that cross. To me, one of the most important things that you can do is, if you have a dog that is you're seeing is reproducing, is get that dog collected, store
Hmm.
that semen
Yeah.
because you have it.
Hmm.
Even if I got out of it today, let's say a tornado came here, destroyed my kennel, and I was done. I have frozen semen at the university.
Yeah.
I would go and I would look for the best female, cur dog that I could find.
Yep.
And then I would cross back into that. So it's like, kind of like that friendship bread that goes around from time to time where you always keep a
Yeah.
start,
Well, a-
So
and within a couple of generations, you've got multiple males collected. Those dogs they would basically still be all your stock after, 3 generations, basically.
right. That's one of the big things that I recommend people do is if
Hmm.
you've got a good dog, get them collected.
Yeah.
What's the worst thing? You don't use it.
Hmm.
That's the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
But you're safe. I was talking to one of the super stakes they were talking about a local dog, the Skull dog, Wrangler Skull, I think was his name, and he had thrown all kinds of good puppies like that did really well in the PKC Super Stakes, but they never got him collected. And then he I don't remember if he got hit or what happened to him, but he died.
Hmm.
And he obviously was a really good reproducer, and of all these local dogs that ended up shining. So I mean, there's just certain things that you really, you should do for the betterment of the breed. If you've got a good dog, I don't care if doesn't have a championship title on it, and you know that it's a dog that, would benefit the breed, collect it.
Definitely. Listening to everything you're saying, I'm learning a lot here, and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, some of it I've known or learned through the years, but I really like what you're saying. You did your research, you found good reproducing males when you wanted to make an outcross, and then you have these tightly bred females, so you have a lot of consistency in your female line, and then you go to a good reproducing male, and then you cross that back into your tightly bred line. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's what's made you successful even through your outcrosses.
Yeah. Well, and we even did, we had our males cross one to hounds, and then we had, our females the same thing. Like the cedar dog that my rat dog came from, she was highly, in. So,
Mm-hmm.
Either way we went, we
Gotcha.
knew we were going to hit it with a concentration
Mm-hmm.
of the genes that, that we prefer.
Yeah.
And this really is all, it all comes down to preference. It's what suits you.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
definitely. Now, we talked a little bit about the registries and stuff. How does one go about getting a tree cur registered? Like, so say a first generation dog.
That, I'll be honest with you. I used to feel like I was on top of my game with that. And nowadays I don't. I'll be honest with you. There have been some changes, like with UKC, you used to, send in, a single registration, your pictures.
Mm-hmm.
Now, now that they started doing it, the X breed, for the hounds, the tree and curs are now, crossbreeds for, them instead of tree and curs. I think with NKC, you can still single register.
Okay.
The same way, where you send in 2 pictures, and you have to, do your single registration.
Mm-hmm.
And those forms, they're on, it's National Kennel Club. You have to spell it all out if you go to their website.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like with the other ones, like USCC and National Sporting Dog, all that, it's the same thing where you just fill out your registration. So it kind of killed the Tree and Cur Association, all these changes. I'll be honest with you. That's kind of I keep writing the article under the head, but I'm like, I probably should change the letterhead because, and it's sad because I don't feel like the tree and cur is the same as just a crossbreed.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like if you stay in somewhere, that needs to go away back to the tree and cur, because I don't feel like my dog, maybe, like I said, she's 3/4 cur.
Mm-hmm.
She's not the same as, other dogs that, somebody might cross, but I don't know. Times have changed on this.
Yeah, like I said, I knew the way UKC, like they closed tree and curs.
Yep.
And then they started the X-breed cur, but now I see nothing online about X-bred curs, so I wasn't sure if they were back to registering those dogs as tree and curs or what. I wasn't really sure.
I'm not sure, and I haven't had to delve into that yet, but I may have to, because I don't. John, like, if Maisie does have puppies, John's dog isn't. I don't think he's registered with UKC. He's registered with NKC.
Okay.
As a tree and cur, but I'm not. I might be in that water. I might be finding out firsthand. But yeah, it used to be a different world. I've seen a lot of changes over the years. Let's put it that way. And and I'm sure I'll see a lot more. And I don't know where it'll go or how it'll go. But the fact is it's a cur and a tree. It's kind of like a tree and fight.
Mm-hmm.
You have your mountain fights, you have different, Mullins fights, things like that. But to me, key word to that is tree and cur. I wish I knew that was going to come up, and I was like, God, I'm not going to have a good answer for him. And I used to have a good answer,
and I've read your articles for years in Full Cry. Now my subscription to Full Cry has fell off here and there, but if I get it, I typically read your articles. And I know at one point, like, you used to be like, oh, yeah, I sent so-and-so a packet of stuff on how to register and stuff. So I knew at one point, like, that was something that you did pretty regularly.
And I still do. Like, I still give them the information for, USCC. I still give them NSC. I give them NKC. Like, I still give out that information and, or mail out registration forms, for people, because some of these older guys, they don't have, internet access. Like my dad would never be able to do that.
Yeah. So
I still do that for people, but I'm just not quite sure about where UKC is on all this, to be honest with you. But,
gotcha.
Whatever. Like, there are so many things now, like I'm looking at all these, like, Pro Sport and all these different things that are
Yeah.
coming up. And I'm like, really it's, UKC is keeping our pedigrees and, they have the, competition events and stuff. But I mean, there's some big registries out there doing some really, really
Yep.
amazing things for squirrel dogs. So,
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how important that's going to be to people anymore.
Hmm.
I guess the tide will tell and people will, make their intentions known on what they want. And the fact is registries, they're money makers.
Yeah.
They make money. The Tree and Cur Association was always service. We would donate money to, plaques, we would help out, but we were
Hmm.
never like a registry or anything. It was never to
Yeah.
be a money maker in life.
Hmm.
So, you know, so people, places will do where the money's direct.
Yeah.
If something fails and they see it's failing, they're gonna change it up. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just a fact. So I'm not
Hmm.
sure. I'm not sure, but I guess we're both gonna find out. All my dogs are NKC and UKC registered. So
Okay.
I'm still in the Tree and Curs with UKC and NKC and stuff like that. But, I haven't crossed out to a hound in a while. So I don't know.
I actually have leopard females. Now, leopards are weird.
Okay.
Depending on the registry, they're either a
Yep.
cur or they could be a hound. And then I had an accidental cross with a plot. So UKC, my dog is X-bred coonhound. But if I were to go to NKC, he would be a tree and cur.
Yep.
I realize where he stands as far as UKC is concerned, but I'm looking at maybe possibly down the line making a cross with a cur with him. That was why I was questioning.
Yeah. You would probably just be, well, if your cur was registered, but they would be Tree and Cur puppies. So,
Hmm.
I always just would fill out the single registration, for people with the puppies, if it was a cross like that for them
Hmm.
to send in.
Gotcha.
But that's probably what you would end up doing.
Hmm.
NKC, the thing is they were there for us in the beginning, and there's a lot of good, different organizations that have come up over the years. So, I mean, there's a lot of options for people.
Yeah.
I just kind of like that NKC, UKC, they have a lot of the pedigrees that go
Hmm.
back,
Yeah.
on file. So
Yep.
that's one of the perks to them. And then the other ones, are, their perks are, what they offer competition wise,
Yeah.
for those who,
Hmm.
are into that aspect. So,
Definitely.
there's pluses and minuses to all of them. And, I
Hmm.
guess it's just what you want. And some people never register their dogs.
Yeah.
I always said you could always tell if somebody was real serious about their dog if they registered it or not by a year. Our Ruby dog. So that was the cross that we made with our Sport onto our Star dog. And we
Hmm.
named all the females after gemstones. So we had
Okay.
Topaz, Ruby, we had a Diamond. And then my brother named Grace. She wasn't, she actually had a real name, but like we instead of like other people give us puppy papers, they'd be like puppy 1, 2, 3, 4, and we realized, you don't have to put a name on them.
Yeah.
So, some guys called my dad. They bought them one dog, and they said, "Hey, this dog's not treeing or doing anything." They put her in a pen and then hunt her, and he said, "Well, okay." He's like, "What's the dog out of?" And they're like, "Who's she out of?" And well, I got to get her papers, and they're like, "Her name's Ruby." So they didn't even know what cross was from us. Her name was still the name that was on the papers. They never transferred the papers over, and so
Yeah.
to us, we could always tell the dedication of the person on if they transferred papers by the time the dog was a year old. If they didn't, they really weren't invested.
Well, by your standard, I would not be invested. I've got a
You would
3-year-old.
not be.
I've got a 3-year-old dog that was born here, and actually, he's the best dog I own at the moment. And I've never sent his papers in.
See, you're not invested. I would put you. You're gonna, I'll be honest with you. I was almost that person with my chocolate lab here. I was like, my chocolate lab's going to be a year old in May, and I haven't gotten her papers in. So in April, I got her papers in. So I was right under the line on that, even though I was highly invested in her. But it is, you pay a penalty. It's a little bit more of a hassle when you don't transfer the papers, over. So.
See, I guess I've gotten a little gun shy because I've transferred a handful of dogs that didn't
And
turn
they
out.
didn't turn out.
So that's why I'm like,
Exactly.
if it turns out and I actually want to do something, I'll just pay the penalty.
There you go. No, I get it. When you've gone through a lot of dogs.
Let me think here. Probably 4 or 5 dogs that I've mailed papers in and transferred them, and then, like I said, they never turned out to much. So
This one you're like, I'm changing my cycle up.
yeah, and like I said, he was born here, so I know exactly what he is.
What's funny is the Ruby dog, she was the one who was the first 4-way super grand in NKC. The dog that
Okay.
wouldn't treat it, my dad went back and gave them their money back on. She was one of the best dogs we had, one of our best reproducers. So, everything happens for a reason.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I've really liked your story. That's one of the things that always stood out to me. Like I said, that Shamrock dog, when I first got involved, he was what I wanted. And actually, I almost went to Virginia and bought a dog that was off of your guys' dogs. Like somebody had bought a couple dogs from you guys and had bred them. So it wasn't anything directly from you, but like I said, it was like a second generation, but both parents were from you guys. And
Yeah, we have a pretty big following. Virginia, North Carolina, West Virginia, South Carolina. We got a lot of dogs in that area.
mm-hmm. And the only reason I didn't is the guy that my mentor, he was like, I was kind of getting to know him. I was about to go to college, and I was trying to, I randomly send some guy an email, say, hey, I'm going to college about a half an hour from you. Can I basically rent a kennel? And he was like, he's like, well, give me a call. And he's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I want to buy this dog, but I have nowhere to put it when I go to college. My parents don't want to keep it. He goes, why are you going to buy a dog? I'm like, because I want to get into this. And he's like, well, don't buy a dog. Just come hunt with me. And he goes, I've got a kennel full of dogs. So he was, just trying to help me out and saying,
Yeah,
instead of buying a dog, just come hunt. So
that's funny.
that was the only reason I probably would have bought a dog out of your guys' dogs if I would have had somewhere to put it. And he was just like, I've got my kennels full. So he's like, just come hunt with my dogs.
Well, and that's it. When you get older, I loved when my kids were competition hunting because I had other handlers. I had people to go to the woods with me.
Mm-hmm.
I tell Billy all the time, like, when he takes me squirrel hunting, I'm like a little girl in a candy shop, I'm like, ooh, all giddy and stuff. And I'm like, how many men would love to have a wife who like begs, will you please take me, like, let's go somewhere, away from here, like I go here around here because it's safe.
Yeah.
So I'm like, you have no idea. Like, you're so lucky. What's funny is the dogs that I was telling you that we have like in North Carolina, West Virginia, the X dogs from that cross,
mm-hmm.
they made some of the top bear dogs that people had. And it was all from that particular cross. It was from the X Junior cross that made the really good bear dogs.
Okay. That kind of ties in. So it's kind of funny that you bring up the bears. Is like a lot of the past month I've been talking to cur guys that big game hunt.
Yeah.
So your line has done fairly well then on bears.
With bear and then hog.
Okay.
But the hog dogs were more of like the mountain cur crosses were the better hog dogs. Whereas, like I said, it was it's a common tie that all the really good bear dogs all go back to the X Factor dog that we have.
Okay.
That goes back to X Junior.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something about that combination of that hound and the grit of the cur that just has like really excelled in that particular area.
Interesting.
Yeah,
it
was. It was interesting for us because, in Missouri we have bear now, but, and I remember, we had bear because like my dad, when I was a little girl, he treated bear in an old car in a junkyard, and this was in the 70s. So whenever they say there's no bear in Missouri, he'd be like, I beg to differ.
Yeah.
And then we were, had a competition hunt, and him and my brother, maybe it wasn't. Maybe we were just pleasure hunting. That's bad. Like, you have so many things where it all kind of blends. But we were hunting at Weldon Springs, and I was not with my brother and my dad, but I was, aware of this.
Mm-hmm.
They were hunting around the one lake, and my dad said, that looks like a bear track. And my brother was like, whatever, Ben Lily, and sure enough, it was a bear track, and that was in the 90s.
Okay.
So, and now, we just had a bear get hit on the highway, so they're becoming more prominent here,
mm-hmm.
In Missouri. But we never had, we had the dogs run bobcats, like Clay's Fred dog, who, again, goes back to the X Junior cross.
Okay.
Him and the one little Hope Walker female that Clay had, they ran a bobcat all night long under an old barn that we ended up having to go get them in the morning. But, so we've had the dogs run cat, but we've never had the opportunity for bears. So when people were calling us, we were like, huh. And that was the main factor was they all came from the X Junior cross.
Now, how far back in your dog's pedigree would that be now?
Right now that would be 3 generations back.
Okay.
So, because like I have a female down there off of Fred. So I have Ring, who was off of Fred, who was off of X, who was off of X Junior. So yeah. So 4. I lied to you before. And, she's a different dog than Maisie. Maisie's out of my swamp rat dog. And, Ring they both have the same mother, which is off the Alan Franklin line that I was telling you about. But they
Okay.
have, one was off the swamp rat and the other was off of my son's Fred dog. And the Ring dog, because my daughter's all about Johnny Cash, so I have Cash and Ring. She was hoping she would be born in June, but she was born like July 1st. So she ended up being Ring of Fire. But,
That's funny.
She's a bigger built dog. Even though she's similar to Maisie, she's bigger. And she's quiet. She's a little, she doesn't really take to people. She's a little more cautious, maybe to everybody's friend. But she's more of my combination dog. Like when she's free, she's spot on, accurate. She's just not flashy at all. But yeah, I can definitely see the difference in those two half sisters. And having the same mother, just two different pairs.
Yeah. Now, have you found either your first generations or even like multi generations with the more hound? Do they tend to open more?
That's been hit or miss. That's what I was telling Steve. Like I've had some that were open. I had a female that when she was like squeaking, she was on a good track, a good coon track, and when she sounded like the hound in her, she was on a deer. I mean, it just is what it is.
Yeah.
She was open, but a lot of times they'll hit the ground and they'll bark a couple times if it's a really hot track, and then then they shut up and then they get treed.
Okay.
Which is like what I actually prefer, because I don't know how the squirrels are where you are, but like we have a lot of gray squirrels. So I don't want them opening on the ground the whole while, because, you might get the one squirrel they're working, but everything else is going to be gone. So I actually kind of prefer where they hit it, kind of let you know where they're going, and then, get treed.
Yeah.
But like I told Steve, my mountain curs, they were as open as a screen door in July.
Really?
My little females, yeah, they were the most open dog I had. So everybody be like, "Oh, your dog's rowdy, they're open," and I'm like, my mountain curs were the most open dogs I had. But it was part of the breed standard, There's a reason there's breed standards. That's what these dogs did,
Yeah.
And in the mountains, think about it. You're going to want to be able to hear your dog a little more than, where it's flat. So you can keep up with them. That's, in the times before tracking collars and beeping collars, I remember we'd lose a dog and we'd put a coat out where we poked out, checking it.
Heard many stories of that.
But the number one thing I've always had to get dogs back was having your name on the collar.
Okay.
Name and number.
It was funny. I just saw a Facebook post and a friend of mine was like, he's like, make sure you have your name and your phone number on a dog's tag. He goes, I don't care what the dog's name is. Just with like the whole 4th of July.
They've gotten that close. They don't need to know the dog's name at that point. They're already reading your name and your number.
Yeah. That's fine.
So it sounded like we were wrapping up. Any other questions you have for me?
No, I have no more questions, but I do want another story or two about your dogs.
I can tell you a story that, we still make fun of to this day is, we had a dog named Glory, and my brother and I and my dad were all hunting in the state conservation area, and Glory was like obsessed with my dad. So he had to go to the bathroom. And it wasn't one of those, where he just slide off. He was like, hold Glory's collar. Hold it. Do not let go of it. So he goes off, and my brother and I are looking at each other, and all of a sudden my brother lets go, and he's like, no, Glory, no. And then he's like, and then we hear my dad, he's like, no, Glory, go away, Glory, go away. And we're belly laughing. The only, I think all of our, no offense to all the Christians out there, but I think most of our dogs thought that their names were, and then their name when my dad would be upset at them. And that's like the only time he ever used that term was with dogs. Like, I've heard him say some stuff, but not that term. It was only dogs that brought that one out in him. So it gets better. So my uncle decided he was going to take he wanted to take his son coon hunting, so we were like, okay, and it was summer. We were running the dogs. We weren't actually shooting dogs, out at that time. But we go and we're with my uncle, and we had the sage dog, and he was notorious. If it was dead, smelly, he wouldn't get muddy. But if it was disgusting, he'd roll in it.
Yep.
So we're sitting on this log, and around the area, because where we hunted it's still a really good hunting spot. It's on the river, when you get those, squirrels that come in, when they're migrating, and they've always got crops in there. So it's always been good hunting. So Sage comes in, and I pet him, and I look on my hand, and I'm pretty sure it's what my dad had left in the woods earlier,
Oh.
a couple days earlier. Yeah,
Hmm.
I was like, you want to talk about instant karma? That was one of them. That was not fun. I was like, my dad got the last laugh on that one. I was, and you're in the woods, like you're stuck. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh my god, it's not funny anymore. It's not funny anymore at all.
I had a friend that his dog did the same thing. He hunted somewhere and he had the same situation, and then a few nights later he hunted the same place, and the dog came in, and it was pretty obvious what he'd been rolling in.
Yeah, it's just like, oh, like I said, we belly laughed so hard at my dad hearing it. Go, and like, we were laughing so hard. I was like, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's what you know. That's when you know karma exists in the
Yeah.
world. So there was that, and then with Rat, I traveled all over with Rat.
Hmm.
Rat and Rock, kind of going back to something that I do want people to be aware of, and I'm just kind of curious if other people that competition hunted heavily. I actually thought there was a problem with lymphoma. I thought we had a genetic issue with lymphoma because the feeder female that was the mother to my rat dog came off of Shamrock, and Shamrock died at 5 of lymphoma.
Okay.
And then my rat dog died at 5 of lymphoma.
Hmm.
And my heaven dog died of lymphoma. And so they all went back to Rock. And now I don't have any dogs dying of lymphoma. And, we were hunting Indiana, Illinois, all these farmlands. And I watch these Roundup commercials on TV where they're like, if you've gotten lymphoma and you've sprayed Roundup. And I'm like, huh.
Yeah.
So I always wondered if other people had the same issue with like hunting the farmland,
Hmm.
like with the Roundup formula. Obviously, it caused lymphoma and your dogs are drinking out of creeks and puddles. And,
Yeah.
that was something, that really, I really thought, I was like, we're done. The line is done.
Hmm.
If this is in here, that's heavy, we can't continue to go. But it was all the dogs that we heavily competition hunted. So it was kind of strange.
Who's the best dog you've ever had?
Oh, it has to be the Daisy dog. And she really wasn't my favorite dog. That's what's bad. It's like, even in my last podcast, I have to give Daisy all the credit,
Hmm.
but she was a hard-headed dog. Like, she was my dad's dog. She was my brother's dog. She didn't really care for me. Star bit Billy. He startled her one time, and the cherry was sitting and broke, and she snapped at him, and I was like, oh my god. And so, she was one that, you couldn't sneak up on her or anything like that. But yeah, so she, with Billy, she almost bit my husband.
Now Daisy was the Walker Stevens, and Star was her
She was
daughter.
Daisy would be considered our foundation stock.
Hmm.
She was definitely, like I said with his podcast, she was the dog that we hooked up to a harness, and she pulled my brother on a sled, and she got lost so many times. We would be looking for Daisy. I mean, that dog didn't have Lyme disease. No dog ever did, because we'd get her back from like bush wildlife and all these places, and she'd be covered in ticks, and you'd spend the whole time picking ticks off. And and then Grace and Copper was a dog. You could put him in the truck. Him and my dad had a love-hate relationship. And Copper we actually got Copper back. Copper had been abused. And so he was not, like I said, he was a dog that was really good in certain situations. In certain situations, he wasn't. You could not go head first in and get him out of the truck. And so we were hunting at a spot we always went, and Copper disappeared. And my dad's like, what? This is before tracking collars, and he was like, where did Copper go? And so somebody had given him a ride in their truck, and then got him quite a ways from where we were hunting, probably about 40 minutes from where we were hunting. And the guy's wife finally got to where she could read his collars. He would not let the guy that picked him up get him. So, he was one. I've watched my dad would try to breed him, and he'd growl at my dad. Oh, they had the greatest relationship. He was a dog that, I really didn't talk much about, but really was a dog that was instrumental. Like, my dad was like, he was like a pro athlete. He was like, I hated that dog. He's like, I hated him. He hated me. He's like, but he was probably one of the best competition dogs. Like, if we wanted to squirrel hunt him, though, we'd have to pull him off a coon, because he loved to coon hunt. He was
Okay.
short, blocky, natural bob, yellow
Hmm.
brindle cross. But like I said, he had a pretty rough start. We got him back in life, but him and Ruby actually produced some of the best dogs. So he was always interesting. And, we had a lot of competition in our own family. Like, everybody wanted to be the best. My dad was hunting Ruby, Billy was hunting Sage, Alex was hunting Grace, then we'd hunt Copper, and then we'd have X and, Rat. And I mean, we kind of, we were always pushing each other. We were harder on each other than we were with anybody that we hunted against.
Yeah.
Um,
That's probably what drove your breeding program then. And at the same point, I'm assuming that, especially when you had all these dogs, that you and your brother were out of your parents' house and kind of had. So, I mean, you basically had 3 kennels all working together.
Kennels. Yep. My dad was the money man. I'm just going to tell you, or he'd drive across the country to go pick up a really good dog. Like, he'd find a female for sale that was, really, really well bred. And, we had a dog named Molly who was actually one of the very first cur crosses off of Rat Attack. She was slightly older than what we had, and she was a top reproducer for us, and he'd drive. We had a dog we named Radar Red because he drove through tornadoes in Indiana to go pick this dog, up. And so we've had a lot of good times. A lot of early morning squirrel hunts where you're treeing coons. I think my brother and I have watched our dad fall more than anybody should ever watch anybody fall in their whole life. Like, my poor dad, his knees are so bad. Now, there's no way, he could get out in the woods and do what we did. But we had a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And then there were hard times, like when I went through the divorce and, my parents went through a divorce and that took a lot of wind out of our sails too, at a period. And, I'm grateful because obviously I remarried Billy, but, it was still a lot to go through. And like I said,
definitely.
the dogs actually helped get me through that because I've decided I'm not an easy woman to deal with. I mean, I got a lot of perks. I go to work, I clean kennels, I hunt, but I cook, I clean. I always said, I'd probably be a lot further along in this game if I had like a wife. I'm like trying to do raising babies, going to sports, doing laundry, cleaning house, and then still hunting and doing all this stuff on top of it, writing articles. I'm like, if I had a wife, I'd have been a lot further in this game than I am today. But
and writing articles that's a big thing. You write a lot of articles.
I do write a lot of articles.
It's not like, oh yeah, you write one little article here and there. No, you're writing quite a few every month.
Well, and I actually wrote about our upcoming. I always have to submit my articles a month beforehand. So the first is the deadline, and I'll be honest with you, the first gets pretty close before all of a sudden I focus. But I was writing about our podcast, and how this is an offshoot from through the podcast with Steve, and I said there's a market for all of it. Like I love writing the articles because if you don't have internet. If let's say the satellites go down, you got a solar flare, you have the written word, and people like to see their pictures, in magazines. People like to read the magazines. They like to hold on to that.
Yep.
And then these podcasts, there's so much information that gets put out, and, people can drive and they can listen to it as they're driving, and I mean, we are very fortunate to live in an era. I mean, because you're telling me you were on Squirrel Dogs and all that. I remember getting dial-up internet, and getting access to the internet, the internet for the first time ever, and getting my first computer. And look at what we have available to us now. It's amazing, and I think back to the people who came over, the forefathers, who had all these mountain dogs and these hounds. My dad always says, coon hound is a fox hound that pulled up in trees, and Rose and I, we went to a fox pen, I guess, right before COVID. So I guess 2019, went to Grand American with her. And then Terry had a foxhound thing. And so we went with him to the foxhound thing, and they actually let us in the pen during the competition, and we're driving around, and we hear this dog, and he is hammered treed. And I'm like, well, he's not going to make much of a foxhound, but boy, he's giving somebody a nice coon dog, if they can break him off possum, because that's what he was treeing on. But, it all goes back to that, and they managed to keep all of this alive for us. and
Oh
and
yeah, definitely.
we get the lazy way. Like, I remember getting the map, the atlas house field to travel to a hunt, in Indiana, and looking, okay, I'm taking, 70 to this, and
Yep,
so it's funny how things have changed.
definitely.
I see it a lot in the competition too, like in the coon hunting. It's right. I'll be honest with you. My pet peeve is people who don't know how to call their dog and call it off the GPS. I can't stand that. I watch these kids with the Garmin, and like I was just at a big PKC youth hunt, and
Hmm.
we didn't have a very good connection, and a kid couldn't call his dog because his Garmin wasn't picking it up, and I was old school when my kids started competition hunting. I put the Garmin on there, but I said, you only pull it out if we got to find this dog.
Yeah.
You gotta know your dog, know when your dog sounds like when it locates, what it sounds like when it trees,
Hmm.
and if you need the Garmin, then you can. We're not raising handlers anymore. People are just raising. It's like a computer game, and I don't
Yep.
like that aspect of it. I don't want us to lose our tradition.
Hmm.
I don't want us to get lazy because we do have a lot of luxuries,
Oh yeah.
but it's still important to get out there and to know your dog.
Hmm.
Know what your dog's strengths are, know what your dog's weaknesses are. Be able to call your dog, like even if you're pleasure hunting.
Yeah.
We pleasure hunt. We pretend it was competition hunt. Like
Hmm.
that's what we did to get ready for an event.
Yeah.
Um,
Now, when I first got started, now I hunted with a guy that had a Garmin, but like I said, I didn't have a dog, I didn't have a Garmin, so I'm out there just listening. He's watching the Garmin. He can't hear very well. He's an older guy, and so a lot of times he's looking at the Garmin because he just couldn't hear his dogs. And I'd be like, "Oh yeah, they're over there." And he's like, "How do you know?" I'm like, "Oh, I just heard them." He goes, "Oh, okay."
well, and you get to a certain age, like where my father-in-law, like I know he doesn't hear certain things if I say it in a
Hmm.
certain tone. Like I have to talk louder and think.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with dogs. So
Hmm.
I mean, there's a time and a place for everything, but you knew that dog.
Yeah.
If I go on a competition cast, I'm going to know within the first 15 minutes what all of our dogs sound like.
Hmm. No, it's definitely a skill.
I'd like to tell you all these exciting hunt stories, but like I really am drawing blanks. Like,
You've given me quite a few good stories, and I appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me tonight. I've been very interested in your dogs for years. I've followed your columns, and you mentioned one thing about people like seeing their dog. I sent you a picture 10 years ago. I don't know. Well, no, it's longer than 10 years ago. 12, 13 years ago, and you put it in there. And I would tell you what, as an 18-year-old kid that just got his first dog, like I was happy as could be to see my picture of my dog in your article.
well, see, that makes me happy. That it does. It makes me really happy. And sometimes I always focus when I drop a ball. And there's been times in life I've dropped a ball and I need to write about something, and I'll send in the article and the pictures, and I'll be like, I forgot that one. But I never intend to. It's never my
Hmm.
intention, to do that. So it makes me happy when I hear stuff like that with you. I had a young boy who won a big PKC youth event. He said, the blue tip breeders wants me to write an article, and I said, well, if you need my help, I'll be glad to help you. He's like, well, I'll pay you. I'm like, I don't want you to pay me. Like, this is for you. Like, if you want me to look it over, when you get done, whatever you need from me, I said, but all I ask of you is down the line, pay it forward to a kid,
Yeah.
be there for a kid, be that person who's willing to help them if they need something. Because, and I sound like so soapboxy, and I say it all the time in my columns, like kids have so many options
Hmm.
in life.
Oh yeah.
And most of the kids are in front of a screen, they're in front of an iPad, they are not interested in going in the woods. Most kids nowadays, I swear, are vitamin D deficient. I look at them and I'm like, is your skin translucent? Like, what in the world, Like, so we want to encourage children, and like when
Hmm.
my kids were young and I was hunting, taking them out with rats, I didn't shoot squirrels out in front of my kids because Rose was little. I didn't want her to have that, oh my gosh, we're killing stuff. I
Hmm.
wanted her to enjoy nature. I wanted her to enjoy the dog. I didn't want her to be scared of anything or grossed out by anything. Now down the line, what she chooses to do, obviously she got heavily into the dogs and hunting, but just take them out in the woods.
Yeah.
Take them for a walk with your dog while you're working your dog. We don't have to shoot things in front of them. Most kids have got in their heads that guns are bad. We want to take kids out. We want to slowly introduce them to things. We want to make them realize that no, not all guns are bad.
Yeah.
Not not everything is bad in this world, and let them see what nature's all about. When I get my dogs out, I just run them here on the farm. But the fact is, on this, I realized I had a new mulberry bush that was in bloom, or my blackberries are out, or it's not a good year for my wild asparagus. I always notice something different about the place where I live daily.
Yeah.
There's so many therapeutic, components to being out in nature that our world's a hot mess, and that's because people aren't outside enough. Go outside and play.
I agree.
My thing. Take a kid outside and play.
I agree. I've got a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old.
And I'm glad I ran your picture of your dog when you were 18. That makes me feel really old now. Because how old are you?
32.
Yeah, I feel really old now. Thanks.
Well, I'm sorry. I did not mean to make you feel old.
It's okay. Being a grandma kind of did that. No, I'm okay. I think every era that we're alive brings something better. Like in your 20s, you're trying to figure out who you are. You're establishing yourself. In your 30s, I think you really start to get a grip on your identity, your goals. My 40s were wonderful. Like life was more stable. And my 50s, I'm only 1 year in, but I'm going to tell you it's been a good one. So,
good.
My dad says the 70s suck, but he's probably right.
That's funny.
I got a little time.
Definitely.
But I appreciate you sharing everything with with me about, what you followed in the years with the dogs and what you've noticed. So that I always like learning from other people myself.
No, like I said, I really appreciate taking the time. So.
And I thank you for having me.
All right. Well, have a good night.
You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Tree Talking Media. And until next time, keep them talking in the timber.